The office buzzed with the usual Monday morning energy. Employees sipped coffee, typed furiously on keyboards, and exchanged polite greetings. At the center of it all stood James, a young black intern, dressed neatly in a crisp white shirt and navy slacks. His calm demeanor and warm smile radiated confidence, but the weight of being the only black intern in the room wasn't lost on him. James had joined the company a week earlier, eager to learn and prove himself. He believed in hard work, humility, and letting his actions speak louder than words. But there was one person in the office who had already decided he didn't belong. The manager, Susan. Susan was a sharp-dressed woman in her mid-40s, known for her no-nonsense attitude and demanding nature. She prided herself on running a tight ship, but beneath her polished exterior, she carried prejudices that she didn't bother to hide. From the moment Susan first saw James during his orientation, she had been cold toward him. She scrutinized his every move, nitpicking his work while turning a blind eye to the mistakes of others. On this particular morning, James approached Susan with a nervous but determined expression, holding a file he had worked on late into the night. "Good morning, Susan," he said, his voice steady but polite. "I've completed the client proposal you asked for. Would you like me to review it with you?" Susan barely looked up from her computer screen, her eyes flicking dismissively to the file in his hand. "Just leave it on my desk," she said curtly. "I'll get to it when I have time." James hesitated, sensing the indifference in her tone but refusing to let it deter him. "I think it's an important project and I'd appreciate your feedback. I want to make sure it meets your standards." Susan finally looked up, her lips curling into a faint, sarcastic smile. "James, let me be honest with you," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Not everyone is cut out for this kind of work. It's fast-paced, demanding, and requires finesse." James frowned slightly, unsure of what she meant. "I understand that," he replied carefully. "That's why I'm here, to learn and grow." Susan leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Well, learning isn't always enough. Some people just don't have the instincts for it. But we'll see." Her words hung in the air like a cloud, heavy with implication. James nodded politely, his expression unreadable, and walked away. But inside, he felt the sting of her subtle insult. As James returned to his desk, a few of his colleagues glanced at him with pity, having overheard the exchange. He sat down and opened his laptop, determined not to let Susan's words affect his work. What he didn't know was that Susan had already made up her mind about him, and she was planning to act on it. Susan stood in her glass-paneled office, watching James through narrowed eyes. She had always trusted her instincts, and her instinct told her James didn't belong here. His confidence irritated her. His polished demeanor seemed out of place, and most of all, she resented how some of the team had started warming up to him. It didn't sit well with her. Later that day, Susan called a quick meeting with the interns, assigning tasks for an upcoming project. It was a crucial pitch for a major client, one that could shape the company's direction for the next quarter. Susan deliberately handed the bulk of the work to James, piling on extra responsibilities she knew were nearly impossible to complete in the given time frame. "James, you'll be responsible for preparing the market research, compiling the data analysis, and putting together the presentation deck," Susan said, her voice sickly sweet. "I know it's a lot, but this is a chance for you to prove yourself. Show us what you're made of." The other interns exchanged uneasy glances, knowing the workload she had given James was absurd. One of them, Clara, tentatively spoke up. "Susan, shouldn't we divide the tasks more evenly? It's a big project." Susan's eyes flicked toward Clara, her smile thinning into a sharp line. "Clara, thank you for your input, but I think James can handle it. After all, he's here to grow, isn't he?" James nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll do my best," he said, though he could sense the trap she was setting. Still, he wasn't one to back down from a challenge. For the next 3 days, James worked tirelessly. He stayed late at the office, skipped lunch breaks, and even brought work home. By the time Friday rolled around, he had completed everything. The market research was thorough, the data analysis was precise, and the presentation deck was polished and professional. When James handed the finished work to Susan that morning, her face betrayed a flicker of surprise before she quickly masked it with indifference. "I'll take a look at it," she said flatly, setting the folder aside without so much as a glance. The presentation was scheduled for that afternoon. James spent his time rehearsing, ensuring he was prepared for any questions the client might ask. But as the meeting drew near, Susan appeared at his desk. "Change of plans," she announced, her tone cold. I'll be presenting the deck, you can sit this one out. James stared at her, taken aback. But I've been preparing for this all week, he said. I know the material inside out. Susan's smile didn't reach her eyes. That's nice, but I think it's best if I handle it. Maybe next time. Frustration simmered beneath James's calm exterior. But he nodded. Understood, he said quietly. During the presentation, James sat at the back of the room, watching as Susan took credit for his work. She breezed through the slides, confidently delivering the points he had spent hours perfecting. The clients seemed impressed, and Susan basked in their praise, never once acknowledging the person who had done all the work. When the meeting ended, Susan returned to her office, a satisfied smirk on her face. She had successfully kept James in his place, or so she thought. What she didn't realize was that her actions had been noticed by someone she couldn't afford to cross. The office buzzed with the afterglow of the successful client pitch. Employees chatted excitedly, and Susan, clearly pleased with herself, received congratulatory handshakes from senior staff. James, on the other hand, sat quietly at his desk, his mind racing. He had given his all to that project, only to watch his efforts go unacknowledged. But he wasn't one to complain. He had grown up learning that dignity and patience were more powerful than confrontation. Later that afternoon, while James was engrossed in another task, the office door swung open, and a tall man in a tailored suit walked in. His presence immediately commanded attention. Heads turned, whispers began, and an unmistakable air of authority filled the room. It was Marcus Sterling, the billionaire owner of the company and one of the most influential businessmen in the industry. Marcus rarely visited the office unannounced, and his unexpected arrival set everyone on edge. Even Susan, who prided herself on being composed, felt a twinge of nervousness as she rushed out of her office to greet him. Mr. Sterling, what a pleasant surprise, Susan said, plastering on her most charming smile. What brings you here today? Marcus's sharp eyes scanned the room before settling on Susan. I had some business in the area, and thought I'd stop by to see how things are running here, he replied in a calm but authoritative tone. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Not at all, Susan said quickly. Everything is running smoothly. We just wrapped up a very successful client pitch, actually. Is that so? Marcus said, raising an eyebrow. I'd love to hear more about it. Susan's chest swelled with pride. Of course. Let me show you the presentation we put together. It was a team effort, of course, she added, though she fully intended to take credit for the work. As Susan led Marcus toward her office, James glanced up from his desk. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Marcus's expression softened ever so slightly. He gave James a small, almost imperceptible nod before following Susan. Inside her office, Susan launched into her polished explanation of the project, highlighting the client's needs, the proposed solutions, and the strategy moving forward. She spoke with confidence, but Marcus's expression remained unreadable. Finally, he held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. This is excellent work, he said, his tone neutral. Who was responsible for putting this together? Susan hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to betray her. Well, as the manager, I oversaw the entire process, she said smoothly. But the team played a role as well. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. Which member of the team, specifically? Susan shifted uncomfortably, realizing she couldn't skirt around the question. Our intern, James, contributed to the research and analysis, she admitted reluctantly. But of course I refined and finalized everything. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. I'd like to speak with James, he said firmly. Call him in. Susan's smile faltered. Oh, there's no need to bother him. I can answer any questions you have. Call him in, Marcus repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Begrudgingly, Susan stepped out of her office and motioned for James to come over. As James entered the room, he felt the tension immediately. He greeted Marcus with a polite handshake, his posture confident despite the uncertainty of the situation. James, Marcus began, his voice warm but measured. I've heard you played a significant role in preparing the presentation for today's pitch. Is that true? James glanced at Susan, who avoided his gaze, then back at Marcus. Yes, sir, he said simply. I handled the market research, data analysis, and created the presentation deck. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. And were you involved in delivering the presentation? James hesitated before replying. No, sir. I was told to sit this one out. Marcus's expression hardened ever so slightly, but he maintained his composure. I see, he said. Thank you, James. That will be all for now. As James left the office, Marcus turned back to Susan, his gaze colder than before. We need to have a serious conversation about how things are being managed here, he said, his voice low and firm. Susan's heart sank, but she forced a smile. Of course, Mr. Sterling, I'm happy to address any concerns you have. What Susan didn't know was that this conversation was about to take a very personal turn, one that would leave her reeling. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze never leaving Susan. For the first time that day, her confidence wavered. She adjusted her posture, trying to maintain her composure, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Tell me, Susan, Marcus began, his voice calm yet heavy with authority. What do you think makes a good leader? Susan blinked, caught off guard by the question. Well, she stammered, a good leader ensures the team is productive, manages projects efficiently, and maintains the company's standards. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Interesting. And would you say that you embody those qualities? Susan smiled nervously. Absolutely, Mr. Sterling. I've always prided myself on running a tight ship. Marcus nodded slowly, then leaned forward, placing his elbows on the desk. And how does that philosophy align with the way you've treated James? Susan froze, her mind racing for an explanation. I don't understand, she said hesitantly. Marcus's eyes darkened. You know exactly what I mean. Assigning him an unrealistic workload, taking credit for his work, and excluding him from the presentation. That doesn't sound like leadership to me. That sounds like bullying. Susan's face paled. Mr. Sterling, I assure you, I only wanted to challenge him. He's an intern, after all. It's my job to push him to grow. Marcus's lips curled into a tight smile. That's an interesting spin on what I'd call deliberate sabotage. Susan opened her mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand. Enough, he said sharply, cutting her off. You didn't challenge James because you wanted him to grow. You challenged him because you wanted him to fail. Susan's breath hitched. I didn't mean... You didn't mean what? Marcus interrupted, his voice rising slightly. You didn't mean to single him out? You didn't mean to undermine him? Or you didn't mean for me to find out? Susan's hands clenched into fists under the desk. Mr. Sterling, I assure you, I was only trying to maintain high standards for the team. Marcus leaned back, his expression unreadable. Let me tell you a little more about James, he said, his tone suddenly softer. He's not just an intern. He's my son. The color drained from Susan's face. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She stared at Marcus in stunned silence, her mind scrambling to process his words. That's right, Marcus continued, his eyes fixed on her. James is my youngest son. He wanted to experience what it's like to work his way up from the bottom. No special treatment. No advantages. Just hard work. And you? You tried to crush him at every turn. Susan's voice finally returned, but it was shaky. Mr. Sterling, I had no idea. If I had known... Marcus slammed his hand on the desk, making her flinch. That's exactly the problem, he said, his voice like ice. You didn't know who he was, so you assumed he didn't matter. Is that how you treat people who you think aren't important? Is that how you represent this company? Susan's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, desperately trying to salvage the situation. I made a mistake, she whispered. I see that now. Please give me a chance to make things right. Marcus regarded her for a long moment, his expression hard. Making things right isn't about saving your job, he said coldly. It's about owning your actions and learning from them. But from where I'm sitting, it seems like you're more concerned about your reputation than your integrity. Susan lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. The room was heavy with silence, the weight of Marcus's words settling over her like a storm cloud. I'll be conducting a thorough review of your behavior, Marcus said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. In the meantime, consider yourself on probation. And trust me when I say, if I find any more instances of this kind of conduct, you'll be out the door before you can blink. Susan nodded meekly, the fight drained out of her. Yes, Mr. Sterling, she murmured. As Marcus stood and headed for the door, he paused and looked back at her. One more thing, he said. James doesn't need your approval or your validation. He's already proven himself. The question is, can you? With that, he walked out, leaving Susan alone in her office, drowning in a mixture of shame, fear, and regret. As Marcus left Susan's office, he headed directly toward James's desk. The room, still reeling from Marcus's unexpected visit, was eerily quiet. Every employee pretended to work, but couldn't resist sneaking glances at the unfolding interaction. James stood when Marcus approached, his usual calm demeanor now tinged with confusion. "Mr. Sterling?" he greeted formally, unsure of what his father might say in such a public setting. Marcus smiled faintly, a warmth that felt out of place amid the tense atmosphere. "Walk with me," he said, his tone soft yet commanding. James nodded, grabbing his notebook as he followed Marcus into the corridor. They walked in silence for a moment, before Marcus stopped near the large windows overlooking the city skyline. He turned to face James, his expression unreadable. "I spoke with Susan," Marcus began, his voice steady but low. James swallowed hard. "I see." Marcus studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Why didn't you tell me what was going on?" James hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally, he said, "I didn't want to be treated differently, Dad. I came here to learn, not to be given special treatment because of who I am. And yet," Marcus replied, his tone sharper now, "you let someone walk all over you. Someone who doesn't respect you or the values this company was built on. Why?" James looked down at his shoes, feeling both exposed and defensive. "Because I thought I could handle it," he admitted. "I thought if I worked harder, she'd eventually see my value." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened with understanding. "James, hard work is important, but so is standing up for yourself. Allowing people like Susan to undermine you doesn't just hurt you. It hurts the company and the team. You're not here just to endure challenges. You're here to grow into a leader." James nodded slowly, the weight of his father's words sinking in. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have spoken up." Marcus placed a firm hand on James's shoulder. "It's not too late. Leadership isn't just about knowing when to stay quiet, it's about knowing when to speak. You have a voice, James. Use it." James met his father's gaze, a newfound determination sparking in his eyes. "I will." Marcus smiled, then motioned for them to head back to the office. "Good. Now let's finish this." As they re-entered the workspace, Marcus addressed the room, his commanding voice cutting through the quiet hum of activity. "Everyone, can I have your attention, please?" The employees turned in unison, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Even Susan stepped out of her office, pale and wary, as Marcus continued. "Earlier today, I discovered something deeply troubling. An intern, James, was treated unfairly by his manager. He was undervalued, disrespected, and excluded from opportunities he rightfully earned." Marcus paused, his sharp eyes scanning the room. This company was built on the principles of equality, respect, and meritocracy. If we lose sight of those values, we lose everything. The room was deathly silent as Marcus continued. "Effective immediately, we're implementing new policies to ensure this never happens again. There will be mandatory training for all managers, and any behavior that undermines our values will not be tolerated." Then, turning toward James, Marcus gestured for him to step forward. "James, do you have anything you'd like to say?" James hesitated for a moment, feeling every eye in the room on him. But then, remembering his father's words, he straightened his back and stepped forward. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," James began, addressing the room. "I've learned a lot in my time here, not just about the industry but about resilience and self-worth. I want to say this. Respect isn't something we should have to demand. It's something we should all offer freely, regardless of titles, backgrounds, or positions." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I believe this company has the potential to be a place where everyone thrives, but only if we all hold ourselves accountable. That's all I've ever wanted." The employees began to nod, murmurs of agreement rippling through the room. Even Susan, standing off to the side, looked down, her face a mixture of shame and reflection. Marcus stepped forward again, clapping a hand on James's shoulder. "Well said, James. Let this be a lesson to all of us. Growth isn't just about profits, it's about people." With that, Marcus dismissed the room, leaving everyone to return to their desks. As the employees dispersed, James caught a few glances, some apologetic, others impressed. For the first time, he felt truly seen. As Marcus prepared to leave, he leaned in close to James and said, "Proud of you, son." James smiled, a warmth spreading through him. "Thanks, Dad." The next few days were tense around the office. Everyone knew something had changed, but no one was quite sure what would come next. James felt the shift too. It wasn't just the whispered apologies or the cautious looks from some of the employees. It was the sense that things were finally aligning, What had once felt like an uphill battle to prove himself was now a different kind of challenge, showing that he was more than capable of leading, not just following. The first meeting of the day was with his immediate team. James entered the conference room, a binder in hand, his posture confident but not cocky. As he walked to the head of the table, his eyes scanned the room. People who had once dismissed him were now looking to him for direction. He could feel the weight of their expectations, but this time he wasn't afraid. "Good morning, everyone," James began, his voice steady. "I've been thinking about our last few projects, and I want to make sure we're on the same page moving forward." There were murmurs of agreement, but what struck James the most was the shift in tone. No one was talking over him. No one was second-guessing his decisions. They were all waiting for him to lead them. As he started presenting the new strategy for their upcoming campaign, he saw Susan sitting near the back of the room. She avoided his gaze, but he could tell she was listening closely, likely analyzing his every move. After all, she had been the one who had dismissed him so carelessly not long ago. Now it seemed the tables had turned. James laid out the plan with clarity and precision, highlighting key areas for improvement and proposing new methods for better efficiency. His points were met with nods of approval, and as the meeting drew to a close, there was a palpable sense of respect in the room. "All right," he said, wrapping up. "I'll send out the detailed plan by the end of the day. I'm open to feedback, but let's make sure we're all on board. This isn't just about getting things done. It's about doing them the right way." With that, he dismissed the team. They filed out of the room, exchanging a few words of approval and some hesitant congratulations. James could see it in their eyes. The shift was happening. Later that afternoon, Susan entered his office. Her expression was guarded, but she had no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. "James," she began, her voice slightly strained, "can we talk?" James looked up from his desk. He'd been expecting this moment, but now that it was here, he couldn't help but feel a little curious. She stood there, fidgeting with her notebook, clearly unsure of how to start. "Sure," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "What's on your mind?" Susan sat down slowly. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "I wanted to apologize for how I treated you. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I was wrong." James remained silent for a moment, his gaze steady. He could tell that her apology wasn't just for show. There was real remorse in her words. But still, he couldn't ignore the reality of what had happened. "I appreciate your apology, Susan," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "But you have to understand, it wasn't just about how you treated me. It's about how you treated the entire team. Leadership isn't about controlling others or putting people down, it's about lifting them up and helping them grow." Susan nodded, her shoulders sagging. "I get that now," she said quietly, "and I'll do better. I've already scheduled a meeting with HR for additional training. I want to prove to everyone that I can change." James studied her for a moment before replying, "I hope you do. Because the only way this company is going to move forward is if everyone works together. And that includes you, Susan." For the first time, there was no defensiveness in her eyes, only acceptance. "Thank you for giving me that chance," she said, standing to leave. "I won't let you down again." As she walked out of his office, James sat back in his chair, deep in thought. He wasn't sure what the future held for Susan or the rest of the team, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. The storm had passed, and now it was time to rebuild. The following week, Marcus called James into his office. He was seated behind his desk, a pile of papers in front of him, but as soon as James walked in, he stood up with a smile. "James, come in. Sit down." James took a seat across from his father, and for a moment, they just exchanged a look. No words, but an understanding between them. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "I've been hearing good things from the team. You've really taken charge, son." James smiled. "I've had some great support from the team. They've really come around." Marcus nodded. "I'm proud of you. I've seen a real change in you, and I can tell that you're ready for the next step." James's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with approval. "I've been thinking about your future here, and I want to give you more responsibility. Starting next month, you'll be overseeing a new department. It's a big move, but I believe you're ready." James's eyes widened. "Wow, Dad. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Marcus said with a grin. "Just keep doing what you're doing." As James left his father's office, a rush of emotions flooded over him. He had earned his place in this company. not because of his last name, but because of his hard work, integrity, and leadership. The road ahead was still long, but now for the first time James felt like he had truly found his place. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something even greater. The following month brought a whirlwind of change. James was no longer the intern who was overlooked by some and doubted by others. He had become a symbol of perseverance, of what it meant to rise above prejudice and push for real change. But as his new responsibilities grew, so did the pressure. Leading a new department wasn't just a title. It came with its own set of challenges, and James knew he had to prove himself all over again, this time in front of new eyes. The first few days were hectic, with countless meetings and introductions to key players in the department. James was excited, but there was also an underlying tension as he worked to find his footing. He wasn't just the boss's son anymore. He was the leader of a team, and every decision he made would have an impact. One afternoon, James stood in front of a large conference table filled with his new team. They were a diverse group, from seasoned veterans to fresh faces, all looking to him for direction. Their eyes were curious but cautious. They had heard the rumors. Some of them were skeptical, others simply unsure. "All right, everyone," James began, standing confidently at the head of the table. "Let's get started. First, I want to acknowledge that I'm aware of the challenges we're facing. This department has a lot of potential, but right now, we're not working as efficiently as we could be." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I'm here to change that, but I need all of you to be on board. I won't just be making decisions from the top down. I want your input. I want your feedback, but we need to communicate openly, and we need to get things done. No more excuses." The team sat in silence for a moment, taking in his words. Then, slowly, one of the senior members, a man named Thomas, spoke up. "I hear what you're saying, James, but the truth is, we've been understaffed and overworked for months. A lot of the problems we're facing are out of our control. We've been doing the best we can with what we've got." James nodded, acknowledging the challenge. "I understand, Thomas. And I'm not here to add more pressure. I'm here to make sure we're properly supported and that the workload is more evenly distributed. But we can't keep using excuses as a crutch. We need to find solutions." There was a shift in the room as the team seemed to loosen up, encouraged by his honesty and determination. James had a clear vision, and it was becoming apparent that he wasn't just going to sit back and rely on his last name. He was ready to put in the work. Later that day, as James sat in his office catching up on emails, he received a call from his father. The timing was unexpected, but James immediately picked up. "James, how's everything going?" Marcus's voice was warm, but there was an edge of concern beneath it. "It's going well, Dad," James replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "There's a lot to handle, but I think the team is starting to come together. We're making progress." "I'm glad to hear that," Marcus said. "But listen, I've got a situation I need you to handle. There's a potential partnership on the table, and I need someone I can trust to represent the company. You're the one I want handling this." James sat up straighter. "A partnership? With who?" Marcus paused before answering. "I'll send you the details, but I need you to handle this delicately. It's a big deal, and it could make or break some of the company's future deals. You've got the leadership skills, James. I know you can handle it." James's heart raced as he absorbed the gravity of the situation. This was his chance to prove himself in a real, high-stakes scenario. If he pulled this off, there was no doubt that his place at the company would be solidified. "I won't let you down, Dad," James said, determination flooding his voice. "I know you won't," Marcus replied. "I'll expect your report in a few days." The next few days were a blur as James dug into the details of the partnership. It was a tricky deal, involving multiple stakeholders with conflicting interests. As he reviewed the contracts and met with various teams, he began to feel the pressure mounting. Every decision felt like it could change the course of the entire deal, and James was determined to get it right. During one late-night session in his office, Marcus stopped by unexpectedly. James had been poring over a complex legal document when his father knocked and entered. "How's it going?" Marcus asked, a little more relaxed than he had been earlier. James looked up from the papers, rubbing his eyes. "It's complicated. There are a lot of moving parts here, Dad. I'm not sure where some of these figures are coming from." Marcus walked over and sat down next to him. "You're doing great, James. But remember, you don't have to do everything alone. Don't be afraid to ask for help." James shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, but this is on me. I've got to prove that I can handle it." His father smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. I know, son. But don't mistake doing things alone for doing things right. Sometimes, the best leaders are the ones who know when to lean on others. James took a deep breath, processing his father's words. Thanks, Dad. I'll keep that in mind. The day of the meeting with the potential partners arrived. James stood in front of the boardroom, feeling the weight of the moment. The room was filled with high-profile individuals, each with their own agenda. He had to navigate this meeting with the precision of a chess player, thinking 3 steps ahead. As the meeting progressed, James found himself in the thick of negotiations, speaking confidently about the terms and offering solutions to the issues that had been raised. He had the backing of his team, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely in control. The respect he had earned was palpable. Every decision he made was calculated, each word carefully chosen. After hours of back-and-forth discussions, the deal was finalized. As the partners shook hands and signed the papers, James allowed himself a moment of relief. He had done it. Walking out of the room, James could feel the weight of what he had accomplished. This wasn't just a win for the company, it was a win for him personally. He had proven himself, not just as Marcus's son, but as a capable leader in his own right. The euphoria from securing the partnership didn't last long. As James sat in his office the next day, reviewing the paperwork and considering the next steps, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but something about it made him pick up immediately. James Walker, he answered, trying to sound composed. James, it's Sarah, came the voice on the other end. It was his colleague from HR, and she didn't sound like herself. There was a hint of unease in her tone that instantly made James sit up straighter. Sarah, what's going on? Is everything okay? I think you need to come down to the main office, she said, her voice tight. There's something you should know. It's about Thomas. James frowned, confusion flooding his mind. Thomas? The senior manager? Yeah. Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. There's been an incident, and I think it involves you. It's urgent, James. You need to come. The sudden call caught James off guard, but he didn't waste any time. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the main office. As he walked through the hallways, his mind raced. What could have happened? What did Thomas have to do with this? He had no idea what to expect, but something told him this wasn't going to be good. When he arrived, he found Sarah waiting for him outside a closed door. Her eyes were wide with concern, and she quickly ushered him inside. The moment he stepped in, the atmosphere hit him like a wave. Several senior executives, including Thomas, were gathered around a table. The mood was tense, and everyone seemed to be avoiding eye contact with him. James, thank you for coming. Marcus's voice came from the other side of the room. He was standing with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Please sit down. James took a seat, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. What's going on, Dad? Why is Thomas here? Marcus hesitated for a moment before speaking. There's been a complaint, one that we need to take seriously. A cold chill ran down James's spine. A complaint? What about? Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking down at his hands. It's about the way I treated you when you were still an intern. I didn't know who you were, and I made some comments. I wasn't professional, and I was wrong. James stared at him, trying to process what was happening. His mind flashed back to the first day he'd walked into the office, the ridicule he'd faced, and the harsh treatment he'd endured. He had thought that was just part of the corporate grind. But now, hearing Thomas's confession, it felt different. This wasn't just corporate politics, this was personal. What kind of comments? James asked, his voice low but controlled. Thomas stammered, clearly uncomfortable. I made assumptions about your qualifications. I doubted you because of your appearance, because you didn't look like the kind of person who'd be working here. He faltered again, glancing at his colleagues. I made a mistake. A big one. The room was silent, the weight of Thomas's words sinking in. James didn't know what to say. On one hand, he was angry. Angry at the treatment he'd received. Angry at how he'd been belittled for something so shallow. But on the other hand, he could feel his father's eyes on him, searching for a response, a reaction that would guide the situation. I don't need an apology, James said finally, his voice steady. What I need is for you all to understand that this kind of behavior isn't just a mistake, it's a problem. A problem that goes beyond me and goes straight to the heart of how this company operates. Thomas nodded vigorously. I understand, and I want to make it right. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'll do whatever it takes to make amends." James turned to his father, who was now looking at him with an unreadable expression. "What do you want to do about this?" James asked, his tone now firm. "I didn't ask for any of this, but now it's my responsibility to handle it. We have to do something to make sure no one else has to deal with this kind of treatment." Marcus hesitated before responding. "I agree. This is bigger than one incident, James. We need a policy change. We need to make it clear to everyone here that there will be consequences for behavior like this. No one should ever feel like they're less than because of their appearance, their race, or any other factor." James nodded, a sense of purpose rising in him. "Then let's make the change. Let's make it clear that this kind of culture won't be tolerated here anymore." He stood up, feeling the weight of the room shift as the executives exchanged uneasy glances. "I'm going to make sure we implement training programs, stronger diversity policies, and consequences for anyone who crosses the line. This isn't just about me. This is about creating a company where everyone feels valued and respected, no matter their background." Over the next few weeks, things began to change. James worked with HR to roll out new diversity and inclusion initiatives, and he personally oversaw the implementation of unconscious bias training. He didn't just want to make sure the company was legally compliant. He wanted to foster an environment where respect wasn't just an expectation, it was a core value. The changes weren't always easy. There were some people who resented the new policies, people who had grown comfortable with the old ways. But James stood his ground. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to see it through. And then, just when he thought things were starting to settle, another confrontation occurred. One that would test everything he had worked for. Weeks passed, and the new diversity initiatives began to take root. The training sessions were in full swing, and James could feel the tension in the air shift ever so slightly. At first there was resistance. A few employees who rolled their eyes, others who muttered under their breath. But slowly the conversations began to change. The whispers of discomfort transformed into discussions about growth, inclusion, and mutual respect. James's position within the company grew more secure with each passing day. He wasn't just the owner's son anymore. He had become a symbol of change, a leader who was willing to take difficult stands, even if it meant standing up to those who had been entrenched in their ways for years. However, not everyone was on board. A small group of employees began to push back against the new policies. At first it was subtle, a slow, creeping discontent. But then it became apparent in more direct ways. James began to hear rumors, whispers in the halls that he was only in his position because of his father, that he didn't deserve the responsibility, that he was forcing his agenda onto the company. It hurt. But James knew that change didn't come without resistance. He had expected it, and he wasn't going to let it derail his efforts. One day, James found himself in his office when Sarah called him with urgent news. "You need to get down to the HR office," she said, her voice tight with panic. "There's a situation." "What happened?" James asked, a feeling of dread settling over him. "There's been an incident," she replied. "It's Thomas." James's heart skipped a beat. He had been giving Thomas a chance to redeem himself, to make up for his past mistakes, but now he couldn't help but wonder if his earlier confrontation had only scratched the surface. "I'm on my way," James said, cutting the call. When he arrived at the HR office, the scene was tense. Thomas stood with his back to the door, his face pale, his hands shaking. He didn't look like the same man who had been so eager to apologize and make things right. Sarah was pacing in the corner, her eyes filled with concern. "What happened?" James asked, his voice low. Thomas turned around slowly, his eyes avoiding James's gaze. I've been getting some complaints," he said, his voice strained. "People don't like the changes. They don't like you." James's stomach sank. "What do you mean, they don't like me?" "I mean, there's a group of employees who feel like the company is being taken in the wrong direction. They think the diversity push is alienating them, that it's unfair," Thomas explained, his words tripping over themselves. "They're saying you're trying to turn the company into something it's not." James clenched his jaw. He had known there would be resistance, but to hear it so directly, it stung. The whispers that had once been quiet complaints were now open rebellion. "They're going to protest," Thomas continued, his voice breaking. "They're not going to stop until you're removed from the position." James's blood ran cold. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. These were the same people he had been working alongside for years, the same people he had trusted, and now they were turning on him. "This is a betrayal," James muttered. more to himself than anyone else. Thomas nodded. I don't know what to do, James. I've tried to talk to them, but they're not listening. I think it's bigger than just this. James stared at him for a moment, processing the gravity of the situation. He had worked so hard to make this company a better place, to change its culture for the better, and now it seemed like everything was unraveling. Is there any way to stop this? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't think so, Thomas replied, his shoulders slumping. The group is organized. They're talking about going public with their complaints. About you, about the new policies, about everything. They want the board to intervene. James felt a wave of frustration wash over him. So what now? Now, we have to decide if we're going to fight back, Thomas said, his voice weak but steady. And if you're going to stand your ground. James took a deep breath. He knew this moment would come. He had expected it, but that didn't make it any easier. James spent the next several days holed up in meetings speaking with board members, HR, and legal teams. The company was on the verge of a full-scale revolt. The protesters had gained traction, and whispers of their plans were spreading like wildfire. It was clear that the rebellion wasn't just about the diversity policies. It was about control, about the old guard losing power, about fear of change. James wasn't naive. He knew that these policies threatened the status quo, and some people weren't ready to give up their positions without a fight. But James wasn't going to back down. Not this time. He had come too far, worked too hard, and believed too strongly in the changes he was making. He was willing to risk it all to see it through. The day of the board meeting arrived. The tension in the air was palpable. James stood at the head of the table, the eyes of the board members on him. His father, Marcus, was at his side, looking just as grim as everyone else in the room. James, Marcus said quietly, his voice low, this isn't going to be easy. There's a lot at stake here. I know, James replied, his eyes steady. But I can't let this company go back to the way it was. We've come too far. His father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the room at the board members, all of whom looked like they were waiting for something. A decision. A signal. We need to vote, Marcus said. The board will decide whether we move forward with your vision or take a step back. James swallowed hard. This was the moment. It was time to face the consequences of his decisions. As the votes were tallied, the room fell into an uneasy silence. James could feel the weight of the board's collective gaze on him. His heart was pounding in his chest. When the final votes came in, James looked at his father. Marcus nodded slowly. You've got this, he said, his voice quiet but filled with support. James breathed a sigh of relief as the final tally came through. The board had voted in favor of his vision. The changes would continue. The diversity policies would stay in place, and Thomas's actions would not be tolerated. But James knew the battle was far from over. There would be more obstacles ahead, more resistance, but he was ready. And this time, he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way.